Have you ever imagined that a simple stop at a motel, something so common and mundane, could turn into a nightmare? I, a U.S. Senator, thought it would be just another peaceful night, an exhausting day of appointments, endless meetings, and tiring travel. I just wanted a simple place to rest, and that cheap motel along the road seemed like the perfect choice. But what I didn't know was that, upon checking in, I was about to be embroiled in a mystery that would turn my life upside down. That motel wasn't just a place to sleep. There was something strange there, something in the air that I couldn't explain. I didn't know what it was, but the feeling that I wasn't alone grew as night approached. What I expected to be a well-deserved rest turned into a terrifying experience, full of mystery and fear. Have you ever been through something like this? Have you ever been in a place where you couldn't quite understand what was happening but knew, deep down, that something was very wrong? What I discovered that night you might not believe. When you encounter the unknown, something that defies all logic, the world around you begins to change. And that's what happened to me. I, who was simply looking for a good night's sleep, found myself at the center of a mystery that dates back to political assassinations and unexplained disappearances. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to tell you now may surprise you. Everything seemed normal, but that motel, that room, something was wrong. And I was about to find out what happened when someone entered that place without knowing what was behind the doors. Now I know that what awaited me that night would change my life forever. I wasn't alone, and more importantly, I wasn't just being watched. Something much worse was happening, and I was the next victim. As I lay there, my heart pounding, the feeling that something was very wrong only grew. The motel was incredibly quiet, the kind of silence that only heightens fear. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but clues began to appear one by one. And believe me, what I discovered that night wasn't just a mystery, it was a living nightmare. You've probably felt it before, an inexplicable feeling that something, or someone, is always nearby. If this topic resonates with you, if you've also experienced this feeling or experienced something strange you couldn't explain, leave a comment below with your thoughts on what touched you most. What were your reactions when you heard about this motel, this story? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and perhaps share more of these mysteries together. If you're enjoying this journey, please like the video to show that you're also diving into this world of mysteries and revelations. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, seek to understand the inexplicable, the haunted, and what lies beyond our eyes. Don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell so you can continue following stories like this. Now, what I'm about to tell you next is even more disturbing, and it will completely change your view of motels. Stay with me, because what follows is just the beginning of what I discovered that night. I'm John Adams, United States Senator, a public figure, always surrounded by commitments and responsibilities. But that night, I didn't want to be the politician. I didn't want to be the person everyone expected me to be. I just wanted to be an ordinary, exhausted man who needed a good night's sleep before heading to the next appointment. I was tired, mentally drained. The road was empty, the journey long, and a stop at a cheap motel along Route 66 seemed like the perfect escape, the rest I needed to recharge my batteries. I've never been the kind of person who cared much about where I stayed. A cheap motel, really cheap, no luxury, no glamour, just a bed to sleep in and a good night's rest. But that night, fate had other plans for me. I didn't know what was about to happen. No idea what that roadside motel was hiding. In fact, I never imagined that something so simple could ensnare me in a web of mystery, danger, and death. I walked in without a second thought, and what I found there changed everything. I've been through so much in my life, both politically and personally. High-stakes situations, difficult decisions, and encounters with people who sometimes make us question the true nature of things. But that place, that motel, with its decaying facade and musty smell in the air, seemed so harmless, so ordinary, like any other place you'd stop for a break on a long trip, except it wasn't. The moment I walked into the room and looked around was when I realized something was wrong. The place felt watched. There was something in the air that couldn't be explained, something that made me feel like I was being watched. No, it wasn't the eyes of the staff, nor the receptionist who handed me the key. It was something deeper, darker. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was, but it was there, watching me, waiting. For a moment I thought it was just fatigue. The stress of the past few weeks, the workload, the commitments, all of it weighing down on me. But even so, something in my mind told me there was more to it than that. Doubt was lingering, and as the night wore on, the shadows in the motel seemed taller, denser. The sound of the TV broke the silence, but I felt the stillness around me was almost unbearable. Something was brewing, something I couldn't foresee. This feeling of unease grew when I began to hear strange sounds from the next room, the sound of something being dragged, a muffled sigh. What disturbed me most was the door to the next room, which was slightly ajar, as if inviting me to look, to discover what was happening. I tried to ignore it, tried to believe it was all just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but instinct told me to look, and I did. When I opened the door to the next room, I saw something I never imagined I'd find in my nightmares. But the truth is, I didn't know if this would be my worst nightmare, or just the beginning of something even deeper, something that would challenge my understanding of reality and place me at the center of a mystery that, to this day, haunts me. Now that I think about it, I know that night was just the starting point. The motel, the room, the sound, the feeling of being watched, it was all connected, and what I was about to discover wasn't just about the motel or what was happening there. It was about something much bigger, something I couldn't simply ignore, something that was waiting to be uncovered. I arrived at the motel, and immediately something struck me as strangely uneasy, as if the place had its own energy, a kind of presence that wasn't visible but was in the air. It was a simple, unassuming place, with an old, tired facade. The sign's light flickered faintly in the distance, almost as if it were about to go out completely. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect on a business trip, but after a long, exhausting day, it seemed like the only viable option. Deep down, I knew this wasn't what I had in mind for a quiet stopover, but fatigue prevailed. I decided I'd rest there and continue my journey the next day. The reception had a sloppy air, and the woman behind the desk looked exhausted, but her expression was strangely blank, as if she'd already seen everything there was to see in a place like this. She handed me the key without saying more than necessary, and before I turned to leave, she made a comment. "Just be careful with the room next door. It's not a good place to spend the night." At the time, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a common warning, a line from someone who works in a place like this and wants to warn guests about anything even slightly out of the ordinary. But deep down, something inside me, a small warning, began to sound. It was an instinct I couldn't ignore. I walked to my room, the hallway light dim, almost off, and the smell of the place began to envelop me. A musty smell, mixed with a faint cigarette odor and a hint of something more ancient. Every step I took seemed to echo, as if the motel itself were watching me, waiting for me. When I finally reached the room door, the key clicked, and the door creaked open slowly, as if the hotel itself were trying to warn me not to enter. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There was no sound of cars on the road, no footsteps in the hallways, only the muffled sound of the wind coming through the window, and the penetrating, almost suffocating silence. The room was simple, with a bed covered in white sheets that, though clean, looked like they'd been used many times. The furniture was old but in good condition, as if the place had tried to maintain some semblance of seriousness, but without much success. The worn carpet on the floor, the curtains that swayed weakly in the breeze. Nothing immediately threatening, but it was precisely this uneasy normality that unsettled me. It was as if the place were trapped in a time capsule, a piece of the past that had never been fully erased. But what made me most uncomfortable was a feeling I couldn't explain. It was as if the motel was waiting for me, not as if it were a place to rest, but as if I were part of something much larger, something I hadn't yet grasped. The feeling that the environment around me was watching me, testing me, placing me in a scenario where I no longer knew what to expect. I looked around the room, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, the exhaustion getting the better of me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong there, something hidden, something that hadn't yet been revealed. It sounds strange, I know, but as I sat up in bed and began to undress, something in the air was different. The silence seemed heavier, the room seemed denser. As I lay down in bed, I still felt a presence there, all around me. I looked at the ceiling, trying to push the thought away, but one thing bothered me more with each passing second. The next room was ajar, and a faint light flickered inside, as if someone were waiting. I knew I shouldn't go there, but curiosity led me to take a look. I got up silently and went to the door separating the rooms. What I saw shocked me. It wasn't someone waiting, but something that couldn't be described with ordinary words. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what was happening in that motel wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just an isolated incident. The room next door had a story, and that story was linked to a series of events I never imagined would be revealed that night. What I discovered made me question the reality of everything around me. Something much bigger was at play, and suddenly I found myself in the middle of something inexplicable, something beyond my comprehension. I was about to uncover something that had been hidden in that place for a long time. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you're also starting to realize that, just like me, something bigger is happening, something that goes beyond what we can see and understand. The receptionist, an elderly woman, looked exhausted. Her eyes were small and tired, and her hunched posture indicated the weight of years had taken its toll on her. But something in the way she looked at me made the air thicker, as if she were carrying a secret she didn't want to share. The forced smile she gave me seemed to be an attempt to disguise the discomfort I sensed. It wasn't the friendliness one would expect from someone working in a place like that, but I was too tired to care. The motel was simple, without luxury, and for a moment I thought she was simply bored with the routine. Still, something in her gaze made me hesitate. She handed me the room key and, in a barely audible voice, said, "Just don't go into the next room." The words didn't make sense at the time, and assuming it was just a common warning, I shrugged and started to leave. It was something like, "Don't touch something that's none of your business," I thought, already a little tired from the day. But there was something more there, a barely perceptible tone of fear or warning, something that dissipated as quickly as it came, but somehow couldn't be ignored. I've never been one to pay much attention to what others say without reason, and that motel, despite its simplicity, seemed like exactly the kind of place you'd expect at a roadside stop, just a place to sleep and continue the journey. I had an important appointment the next day, and to be honest, I just wanted to rest. The receptionist could have given me any kind of standard motel warning, and I might not have noticed, but for some reason, when she said that, a part of me felt uneasy. Once inside the room, I began to slowly undress. The place wasn't large, but it was decently tidy. The bed was simple with clean white sheets, but the lighting was dim, almost dull, as if the motel hadn't invested much in keeping the atmosphere cozy. The musty smell was lingering, as if the place were trying to hide its past. I was sleepy, exhausted, and the silence in the air only heightened my feeling that something was wrong. A silence that, instead of relaxing, made me more alert. I looked at the worn walls, the poorly drawn curtains, and the feeling that there was something else there, something hidden, began to set in. I tried to ignore the uncomfortable thoughts, thinking my mind was just playing tricks. It had been a long day, and the grueling schedule of Senate appointments was already draining me of energy. But as I lay in bed, the receptionist's gaze returned to me. I didn't know what she meant by those words. Don't go into the next room. What could be so strange about the next room? I couldn't help but be curious, but I knew I shouldn't get involved with it any further. It was just a basic motel, right? Nothing special. Or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. Even with my exhaustion, I couldn't completely relax. The silence around me was becoming deafening, and my instincts told me I wasn't truly alone. For a moment I heard a distant sound, something muffled, like a chair had been moved forcefully, or worse, like someone was walking down the hallway. The sound was brief, but enough to make me stand up and look at the door. Something in my mind was telling me not to ignore it, to stay alert, but what could I do? I didn't know, but I knew what was happening in that motel wasn't just a coincidence. I got out of bed and went to the window, trying to see if anyone was passing by in the hallway. The wind howled outside, and the dim light from the sign flickered, briefly illuminating the dark side of the road. The hallway seemed empty, and I saw no one. But it was then that, for the first time, I noticed something strange. The door to the next room was slightly ajar. What could be happening there? I knew I should ignore it and try to rest, but I couldn't. There was something catching my attention, something that wouldn't leave me alone. It was then that I realized the feeling I was having wasn't normal. Something inside me, a small warning, was telling me not to ignore what was happening. The silence now felt oppressive. I wasn't just tired, I was apprehensive. The feeling that something was about to happen, that the motel wasn't as harmless as it seemed, began to grow. I decided I'd go out into the hallway, just to check, maybe get this strange feeling out of my head. When I opened my room door, the hallway was empty. The dim light from the hanging ceiling lamp flickered, and the air was chilly, almost as if wind were seeping through the motel's cracks. I walked slowly to the next room, hesitating with each step. What did I expect to find? I didn't know, but curiosity was consuming me. When I reached the door to room 5, something inside me knew I shouldn't open it, but it was too late. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, the darkness seemed to swallow me, as if something were waiting for me there. Because when I opened that door, I discovered something that changed everything. The motel, room 5, the receptionist's warning. Everything was connected in ways I could never have imagined. I was about to become part of a much larger mystery, something that would challenge everything I knew about what was real and what wasn't. But what truly awaited me that night, in room 5, wasn't just a coincidence. It was a dark truth, something that not even the most powerful politicians could control or understand. The room was simple, as I'd imagined. A bed with white sheets, a stained rug in the corner, and the old television that seemed to be there more for decoration than actual use. The musty smell was in the air, a mix of aged wood and something else, hard to identify, but which made the room even more stuffy and heavy. I didn't mind it much. Exhaustion made me feel like any place with a bed would be good enough to give me the rest I so desperately needed. But as I lay down, a feeling began to grow inside me. A strange sensation, something I couldn't ignore, and it made me feel as if I were being watched. At first, I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just fatigue making me feel things, but the room didn't feel welcoming, and I couldn't understand why something was bothering me so much. I looked around, searching for an explanation. The bed was simply made, but nothing stood out. The only sound in the room was the wind outside, gently blowing against the window. But then my gaze was drawn to the door to the next room, which was ajar. Just a small gap, but enough to make my instincts alert. It was a sensation difficult to describe, as if the door were inviting me to look inside, to investigate what lay beyond that small space, what was hidden in that darkness. Something about that door called to me, and for a moment, I almost gave in to the temptation to go there, see what lay within, but I held back. I knew fatigue was getting the better of me, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to push away the urge, tried to focus on the sound of the wind, the feel of the mattress against my body, the warmth that was beginning to spread throughout the room, but none of it worked. The feeling of being watched only intensified. It was a mixture of unease and an uncontrollable curiosity. The mere fact of being there, in any room, in any city, seemed meaningless. What exactly was bothering me so much? I glanced once more at the half-open door. I couldn't ignore it. What was inside? I didn't know, but I felt that finding out would give me answers about what was happening with the motel, with the receptionist, with this strange environment I couldn't explain. Tension grew within me, as if the room itself were becoming tighter, more claustrophobic. It wasn't a place you'd expect to find at a roadside rest stop, and that made me even more uncomfortable. The motel was trying to make me part of something bigger, something I didn't want to understand. But as always happens in these moments, curiosity overcame fear. I knew that by looking into the next room, I might be making the decision to delve deeper into this mystery, something I could no longer avoid. After all, it was as if I were being drawn by something invisible, something beyond reason. And it was at that exact moment that I realized the motel, the room, the receptionist, and that strange look, everything was connected. Something much bigger was happening, and I was part of it. I didn't know if I was ready to face the truth, but I knew there was no turning back. The half-open door seemed to hold the key to understanding what was happening, but as I got closer, something inside me told me to stop. Still, I couldn't. Curiosity was consuming me, because what lay behind that door wasn't just a natural curiosity. It wasn't something simple, as I'd thought. The motel was involved in something much deeper, and I was about to discover a truth I wasn't prepared to face. What lay inside that room wouldn't just be a revelation. It was the beginning of something that would change everything I knew about that place, about the city, and most importantly, about myself. I was finally beginning to drift off when something abruptly jolted me from my slumber. At first I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps some distant noise, but soon a sharp, desperate sound cut through the silence of the night like a sharp blade. The scream came from the next room, and it wasn't just any scream. It was a scream of terror, something so pure and agonizing that it immediately made my heart race. I knew the sound wasn't normal. It wasn't the kind of noise you hear on a quiet night. Something was happening there, something I couldn't ignore. My mind tried to convince me it was nothing, that I should just go back to sleep. that it was none of my business. After all, it was a cheap motel and I wasn't there to get involved in other people's problems. But instinct prevailed. There was something inside me, a warning, an impulse that couldn't be ignored. Something inside me screamed for action, to go there and see what was happening, as if the scream were a direct call to me. I knew I should stay in my room, but I couldn't. I stood up quickly, feeling the fear growing with every step I took toward the door. Something was wrong, and I needed to find out what it was. I ran to the next room without a second thought. My legs felt heavy, and the air felt thicker as I made my way down the dark hallway. The fear was becoming real, palpable. The hallway felt narrower, and the walls grew closer as I approached the door to the next room. The neon sign's light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and a strange sensation washed over me. Each step felt slower, more burdened, as if I were being pulled into something from which I could not escape. I reached the door of the next room, and the silence was almost absolute. I stood there for a moment, listening, trying to understand what was happening. The screaming had stopped, but a sense of presence was still there, watching me, waiting. It was as if the motel was waiting to show me something I wasn't ready to see. I knew I should back away, that I shouldn't get involved, but I couldn't. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light filtered through it, creating strange shadows in the hallway. My hand, almost instinctively, reached for the doorknob. I hesitated. Fear was taking over, but curiosity was stronger. The pressure to discover the truth pushed me forward, with no control over what I would do next. When I opened the door, the scene that unfolded before me was anything but what I'd imagined. There was no one there. The room was empty, but the smell of something strange lingered in the air. It was as if the place had been recently used, but the silence was deafening. The bed was rumpled and the air felt thicker, as if something had been quickly removed, leaving behind only a disconcerting emptiness. There were no more screams, no more noises, just silence. But it was a heavy silence, something that made every breath seem heavier. I looked around trying to understand what was happening, but all I noticed was a growing sense that something was still there, something that perhaps shouldn't even be there. I entered the room cautiously, feeling the floor creak beneath my feet. I looked at the bed, the walls, and the corner of the room, where the dim light illuminated only part of the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air, the energy of the space, told me something had happened there, something that could not be explained. It wasn't just the room, but the entire motel, the entire atmosphere around it. That seemed to conspire to keep me there, to envelop me in something larger, something I couldn't yet understand. It was then that something caught my eye. On the bedside table lay a crumpled piece of paper, and something about it told me it wasn't just a discarded sheet. As I approached, my heart raced. The paper was covered in hasty, almost illegible writing, but even so, there was something about those words that made me freeze. "They know you're here." The sentence was written bluntly, directly, as if it were a real threat, a message to someone who had already been there. I looked around again, this time more tense, and realized the atmosphere was beginning to change around me. The air felt heavier, and the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It was as if the walls were closing in, as if the motel itself was slowly swallowing me, making me part of something I could no longer control. What was happening there? What had I found? I didn't know yet, but there was something inside me that told me this was just beginning, and I was about to discover something much bigger than I could have imagined. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in that room wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something more behind it, something that connected me directly to this mystery. What I was about to discover would change everything, not just about the motel, but about the town itself, and possibly even about me. But one thing was certain. The truth was there, hidden in the shadows of the next room, waiting to be revealed. Comment below. This makes sense to me. If you also believe that something bigger is behind all this, that there is a hidden truth waiting to be discovered. When I opened the door to the next room, what I saw made me pause for a moment. I was already tense, my heart racing, expecting the worst, but what I found inside that room wasn't what I'd imagined. Across from me, sitting in a simple chair, was an elderly man with graying hair and a distant look in his eyes. He didn't look scary. In fact, he was as calm as anyone could be in a place like that. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed an old typewriter, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. The only thing that stood out in that tranquil scene was the letter that lay on the table beside him. written in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. "You're in danger, Senator." Those words made no sense. Not at that moment. I just stood there, staring at the man and the letter, trying to understand what was happening. What did he mean? How did he know who I was? It didn't make sense. I'd never seen him before. The motel was small, a simple stopover, and this man seemed to have been there a long time. But the letter was clear, and its contents were too direct to ignore. He knew something I didn't yet, and I was about to discover that this simple motel was intertwined with something much bigger than I could have imagined. I looked at the man, waiting for him to say something, anything to explain his presence there, but he just continued dancing his fingers over the typewriter, as if nothing were happening. His calm demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It was as if he knew something I didn't, as if he was waiting for me to ask the right question. But what was I hoping to find? I had no idea. I walked over to the table, still staring at him, and picked up the letter. My hand was shaking, but I was determined to understand what was happening. The musty smell in the air seemed stronger in that room, and the dim light coming through the window only intensified the strange, uncomfortable atmosphere. I opened the letter slowly, trying to process each word, but the meaning of the message seemed more enigmatic with each line. Who was threatening me? Why did this man, sitting there so indifferently, seem to be warning me of something I didn't understand? It was when I turned to him again that the feeling of unease transformed into something more, something deeper. He was still calm, but his gaze had changed. He was watching me with a quiet intensity, as if waiting for me to grasp the gravity of the situation. I knew something was wrong, that there was something dark about it all. But what exactly? Who was this man? What did he know? And why was he here, at the motel, at the same time as me? I looked at the letter again, and as I tried to absorb its meaning, I realized he'd written more than those simple words. He wasn't just warning me. He was asking me to understand something he couldn't tell me directly, something he knew, something he'd experienced. It was as if he'd been placed there to give me a clue, but he couldn't tell me the full truth. The motel, the room, that moment, everything was connected in some way I couldn't yet comprehend. The silence in the room felt heavier now. Every movement I made, every thought that passed through my mind, was interrupted by the feeling that someone was watching everything. It wasn't just the elderly man or the other guests. It was the motel itself, as if the walls, the room, the space itself were aware of my presence and my search for answers. Something in the air moved, but I couldn't see what it was. It was as if the motel was alive, breathing, waiting for me, waiting for the truth. I stepped back, the letter in my hands, and looked at the elderly man once more. He hadn't said a word, but something in his gaze seemed to communicate everything he couldn't. What was happening there was something that transcended any simple explanation. I was in the midst of something much bigger than a simple motel, something that was enveloping me, and I barely knew how to get out of it. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore what was happening. Not anymore. Because what I was beginning to understand was only the beginning. The motel wasn't just a random spot on Route 66, Room 5. That strange place seemed to be the centerpiece of something much more complex. The clues were there, scattered in every corner of the room, in the letter, in the elderly man's gaze. And something told me that the key to understanding all of this was right in front of me. But what exactly was the key? What was he trying to show me? What was behind it all? The letter was in my hands, and each word seemed to weigh more than the last. I read it again, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what was written. "You are in danger, Senator." The handwriting was clear, direct, without flourishes, as if someone were rushing to deliver an urgent message. But it wasn't just the message that bothered me. It was the feeling that there was something much deeper in that paper, something hidden between the lines, something I couldn't yet understand. I didn't know who had written it, but I knew it wasn't an ordinary warning. It wasn't a threat from some criminal. The text didn't have the tone of a blackmail message, nor the aggression of a thief or someone trying to scare me to get something. There was something darker, more personal, in the way those words were written. "You are in danger, Senator." Something told me this danger wasn't just any empty threat. It was real, and it was imminent. I was at the center of something much bigger than I had imagined, something unfolding right under my nose. But what intrigued me most, what consumed me, was the signature. It wasn't just any name. It didn't seem like the name of a criminal, nor of someone seeking only power or money. It was a simple signature, yet at the same time, strangely familiar. It wasn't a name I'd ever seen, but something about the way it was written told me it was important. As if this person, behind this, knew much more than I did. As if they knew something I wasn't yet ready to discover. I tried to rationalize. The letter could be a coincidence, perhaps a cruel joke, an attempt to scare me for no real reason. But as I stared at the words, something inside me told me this wasn't just any message. It was a warning, and as much as I tried to deny it, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something was about to happen, something big, something that involved not just the motel, but a much larger plot, and I was in the middle of it, without knowing how or why. The feeling of being watched intensified. I knew someone was behind this, someone with far more power than I could ever imagine. The town, the motel, the room I was in. Everything seemed connected by an invisible thread. But who was after me? Why me? And what exactly was I supposed to do from here? Questions began to multiply in my mind, and the letter seemed to challenge me to find the answers. I couldn't stand still. I couldn't ignore what was happening. I knew I should investigate further, that I should look for more clues, but something told me the truth was much closer than I imagined. It was then that my mind began to connect the dots. The Tigre, motel, the receptionist, the elderly man, the letter, and even the feeling I'd had since arriving, that something wasn't right. Everything was coming together, and I wasn't prepared for what I was about to discover. The pieces began to fall into place, but the picture that emerged wasn't what I expected. This wasn't a simple roadside stop. It wasn't just any motel. It was a trap, a place where the truth was being kept hidden, and I had been drawn into this story without even realizing it. I looked at the letter once more. There was no turning back. The words were etched in my mind, and I knew I could no longer ignore them. "You are in danger, Senator." But who was behind this? Who knew enough about me, about my work, to send me such a direct and threatening message? The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a key to a puzzle I couldn't solve, but knew I had to solve. The feeling of being in danger was real, but what was most disturbing was the fact that I didn't know who was behind it. I didn't know where the web of mysteries I was now entangled in began or ended. The night seemed colder now. The tension in the air was palpable, and the silence in the motel grew ever denser. I felt as if time had stopped there, waiting for me to make a decision. I knew I couldn't stay there without finding out more, without going beyond the surface of that letter, that room, and everything I'd already seen. But at the same time, something told me to stop, to not get involved anymore. It was a difficult choice, but I knew I couldn't back down. Something inside me was pushing me to discover the truth, and I didn't know what would happen if I decided not to move forward. Because the letter wasn't just a warning, it was a starting point. With each step I took toward the truth, I felt more connected to the mystery, and the more I investigated, the more I realized that the motel wasn't just the setting for some random story. It was at the center of something much bigger, something I didn't yet fully understand, but which I was beginning to feel in every fiber of my being. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew the moment to uncover the truth was approaching. But what exactly would that truth be? What would I discover when I looked closer, when I pushed beyond the boundaries of what I thought was reality? I knew I couldn't just let it go. The feeling growing inside me, the sense that something was wrong, wasn't something I could ignore. It wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't there by chance. The letter, the elderly man, the receptionist's warning, they all seemed connected somehow, and I needed to figure out what was behind it all. Each piece of the puzzle was slowly falling into place, and the more I dug in, the more I realized I was part of something much bigger than I'd imagined. I began to investigate. I searched the motel, room by room, trying to find any clue that might explain what was happening. The hotel was small, but small enough to hide secrets that seemed to have been buried there for decades. The smell of the place, the silence that enveloped it, the way everything seemed exactly where it should be, yet at the same time, it gave me the feeling that nothing was normal, that nothing made sense. It wasn't just room 5. It wasn't just the elderly man or the letter he'd left behind. Everything there, in that place, seemed manipulated, as if someone were pulling the strings behind the curtains, guiding me to a truth that, until that moment, I hadn't been able to see. It was during a meticulous search through the motel's old archives that I found something that chilled me. A piece of yellowed newspaper, partially torn but still legible. It was a story of political assassinations, a series of deaths dating back several years, but with something that immediately caught my attention. All the murders were somehow connected to the motel. Each of those involved had stayed in room 5, the same room where it all began, and most disturbing of all of them were linked to high-stakes political events, involved in important decisions that would shake up the power structure. The realization slowly began to sink in. I was in the middle of something much bigger than a simple motel mystery. With each page I turned, with each clue I found, the lump in my throat tightened. I was becoming embroiled in a web of conspiracies, murders, and secrets of a magnitude I could never have imagined. That seemingly harmless motel was actually the center of it all. Room 5 wasn't just a room. It was a meeting place, a place of hidden transactions, of decisions that determined the fate of powerful people. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a fact. I was being watched. My every move was being monitored, and I realized it as the investigation progressed. It wasn't just a story of murders anymore. There was something much deeper and more insidious at play, something that touched the very fabric of government. And I found myself at the center of it, implicated in a way I could no longer control. That's when I began to understand that the motel wasn't just happening there. It had been chosen. Something much larger, something orchestrated was happening, and I was the key player, the target. What terrified me most was the fact that the answers lay within the motel itself, within room 5, and I didn't know what I would find there. The motel had been the scene of events, encounters, and decisions that shaped the future of many people, and now it felt like I was being drawn into the same web of mysteries and secrets. I knew history was repeating itself. The silence inside the motel grew even denser. The wind seemed to have stopped, the sign blinking more slowly. Everything felt heavier, and I knew the next piece of this puzzle had to come from inside that room. There was no turning back. I was in danger, and more than that, the truth was within my reach. But I didn't know if I was ready to face it. The last time a senator had been there, he'd never left. The motel, that place, was caught in a current of mystery and murder, and I seemed to be the next victim in this story that wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ventured there before me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what I was beginning to understand was only the surface of what lay behind this mysterious web. Every clue seemed to point to something more, and the more I tried to pull away, the deeper I was pulled into the story. I knew I wasn't the first to be drawn into that web, but I felt like I would be the last. I was beginning to realize the truth, and the truth was far more terrifying than I could have imagined. I was at the center of something much bigger, and each step brought me closer to a revelation that would change my life forever. Comment: this makes sense to me if you too are starting to realize that there is something deeper going on, something that goes far beyond what meets the eye. As I dug deeper and deeper, with each clue revealed, something began to click in my mind. I knew something was wrong, but as I investigated, the pieces of the puzzle began to align in ways I wasn't prepared to understand. The motel wasn't just an ordinary place. It wasn't just a roadside stop between appointments. What I was now uncovering was something much darker, a web of political assassinations that spanned decades. And this motel, this room, was the epicenter of it all. The truth revealed itself slowly, as if the place itself were forcing me to confront a story that had been buried there for so long. Every name I'd found in my investigation, every victim, had stayed at that motel, and they'd all been in the same room, room 5. I didn't know if it was a coincidence, but as I pieced it together, something became increasingly clear. Room 5 wasn't just a room. It wasn't just a passing stay at a motel. It was a trap, a meeting place, a hub for something much deeper and more treacherous. But what truly shook me was the discovery that all these victims, in one way or another, were linked to crucial political decisions of national importance and immediate impact. The first feeling that came to mind was disbelief. How could a simple, isolated motel be the epicenter of such a complex network? What could happen there to lure these people to their deaths, one after another, over the years? Something had been done, something calculated, to lead these victims to this very spot. The motel wasn't just a roadside stop. It was the convergence point of all these lives, all these stories, and room 5 was the stage of execution. Fear grew within me. I was being drawn into a mystery that was far from being solved. Room 5 was a sentence, but at the same time it was also an invitation. The motel wasn't just a physical space. It was imbued with a dark energy, a sinister purpose that I couldn't fully comprehend. It was as if the place itself knew its importance, its connection to the murders and disappearances that had occurred there. Something out of control, something greater than simple human choices was at play. As I sifted through the documents and evidence, the conclusion seemed obvious. Each person who passed through the motel was being drawn there, as if chosen for a specific purpose. There was something almost supernatural about it, as if fate were deciding who would be the next victim. I didn't know who was behind it, but the clues indicated I was in the middle of something beyond my comprehension. This wasn't just a motel and a room. It was a web of conspiracy, of political decisions that were no longer just human choices, but rather much more powerful forces at work. And I was increasingly drawn into this plot. With each document, each photo, I moved closer to the truth. But with each discovery, I moved further away from my own safety. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew that the motel and room 5 were the center of it all. The role I was playing was no longer that of a simple visitor to any motel. I was at the epicenter of a dark story, of something meticulously orchestrated, and I was now part of that story, no longer as a spectator, but as an unwitting protagonist. And most terrifying of all was the feeling that I wasn't alone, not even for a second. Each of the victims who passed through that room left something behind. A trace, a signature, a word written in the shadows. The energy I felt was almost palpable. It wasn't just the hotel watching me, but something bigger, something that had been orchestrated so that I was here, at that moment. What was happening wasn't random. Everything was connected, and I was only just beginning to realize the extent of what I had begun to investigate. With each discovery, with each clue I pieced together, an uncomfortable truth began to take shape in my mind. The idea that the motel had been a chosen location, a sacrificial arena for large-scale political decisions, was something I couldn't deny. It wasn't just a transit point, but a stage for a larger game. Something sinister was happening there, and no matter how hard I tried to pull away, I was being drawn into the center of it. Curiosity consumed me, and I knew I couldn't stop. The truth was farther away than I imagined, and yet, at the same time, closer than I would have liked. Because the motel wasn't just a site of murders and conspiracies. It had a history, a reason for existing at that point on the road, in that space. And I was beginning to understand that my role in that story was still being written. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew I was at the center of something much bigger than I could ever imagine. Room 5 wasn't just a part of the motel. It was the connecting point for all the shadows that had crawled there, and without knowing it, I had been drawn to it, like a magnet unable to break free from the force that pulls it. As the investigation deepened, an unsettling feeling took hold of me. It was a feeling that I was no longer safe, that I was being pulled deeper and deeper into a bottomless pit, and I didn't know if I would be able to climb out. The truth, or at least what seemed like the truth, began to reveal itself in frightening ways, and I was becoming a key piece in this puzzle I didn't want to piece together. Every step I took, every clue I uncovered, brought me closer to understanding that somehow I was next. What that meant exactly I didn't know, but the sense of danger was palpable, as if I were being watched closely, unsure by whom or why. I knew something was going on there, something much bigger than a simple motel, something involving politics, assassinations, conspiracies, and decisions that could change the course of the country. But as I sifted through the documents, examined the photos, and tried to piece things together, the sense of threat only grew. I began to realize I was being drawn into a game I didn't know the rules to, and the question that began to recur incessantly in my mind was, why me? What did I have to do with this? Why was I being drawn into this web of mystery and danger? The answer, though it was forming in my mind, was something I didn't want to accept. I had been chosen, and I had no idea how, when, or why. But the truth was, I was at the center of something I didn't fully understand, something much bigger than I could ever imagine. The motel, room 5, the receptionist, the elderly man. All these elements were connected, and I somehow became part of that connection. As my mind tried to process everything I was discovering, fear began to creep in even deeper. I could no longer ignore it. It was no longer just a distant mystery or an investigation into something that happened long ago. Now the story was unfolding before me, and I was at the center of it. The danger was no longer a distant possibility. It was real. It was there, all around me. And I was beginning to understand that what awaited me there was more than just a revelation. I was being manipulated, pulled into a game where the rules were unclear, and where I was already involved in a way that could not be undone. But what terrified me most wasn't the fact that I was in danger. It was the fact that I didn't know who was behind it, who was watching me, who was playing the cards and putting me in the middle of this web. Who else knew what was happening there? Who else was involved? And worse yet, who else was being groomed to become the next victim? I had no answers, and this only increased the tension that was spreading within me. Every step I took felt like the wrong move, and the fear of being followed, of being manipulated, became increasingly real. The motel was no longer just a physical place. It had become a psychological prison, a space where I was being watched, where my freedom was being taken away without my realizing it. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was almost unbearable. I could no longer relax. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified, and the darkness around me, even in the brightest hours, seemed to grow more oppressive. I didn't know who was behind it all, but something told me this threat wasn't new. Those who had stayed there before me, the politicians, the victims, were all connected by something I didn't fully understand. Something or someone was orchestrating it all, and I was only beginning to see the edges of this conspiracy. The motel, which had previously seemed like just any place, a simple and unassuming stop, now revealed itself to be the epicenter of something much larger and more dangerous. Every window, every door, every shadow within the motel seemed to hide a dark truth, and I was getting closer to uncovering it. But the closer I got, the more the feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. I didn't know if I was being hunted, if I was a specific target, or if this was all part of a larger game. But what I knew for sure was that I was involved in something I could no longer escape. Now, I wanted to delve even deeper into this matter, because I was beginning to realize that, in searching for answers, I was creating more questions. The motel, room 5, the previous victims, and the strange feeling that I was being pulled into a story that wasn't mine, but now was. I no longer knew if I was investigating a mystery or if I was being manipulated into following a path that had been laid out for me. And worst of all, the more I investigated, the more I found myself trapped in this maze of lies and conspiracies. It became increasingly clear that the truth I sought lay not just in what I could see, but in something much deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. Comment: I'm on this journey too. If you're also starting to feel that there's something bigger going on, something that's beyond what we can see at first glance, something that's taking us down a path from which there's no turning back. I knew I couldn't run anymore. Every moment I spent inside that motel, every discovery I made, brought me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. The truth was there, within my reach, and although I tried to convince myself I could leave that place without getting involved, I knew deep down that wouldn't be possible. The motel, room 5, the letter, everything was connected in a way I couldn't comprehend until that moment. But the feeling that I was trapped in something bigger, something that didn't make sense, consumed me. The air inside the motel was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the walls knew I was getting closer to the truth. I felt like I was being pulled into a whirlpool, where the answers I sought were mingled with more questions, more enigmas. Each clue I found made me more uneasy, as if, as I pieced it together, the truth became more and more terrifying. The elderly man, the letter, the political assassinations, room 5. It was all connected, but I couldn't see the full picture. I knew there was something much deeper behind it, something kept in the shadows, and I was about to shine a light on it, one way or another. What surprised me was how trapped the motel seemed to be, as if the place itself held a power over me, as if it were watching me, testing me. Every step I took inside felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. It was hard to explain, but the atmosphere around me was becoming denser, harder to escape. Every glance into the next room, every sound in the hallway, made me feel as if something was waiting for me, as if I were at the center of a web of mystery from which there was no escape. And it was in that moment, as I reflected on all this, that the transformation began to take place. I knew that if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to get out of there with my life intact, I needed to unravel the mystery surrounding me. There was no longer room for denial. The truth, however, disconcerting, was the only way to escape that trap, to understand what was happening at the motel, to discover what it truly represented. The letter I had found, the murders, room 5, everything was leading me to a place of revelation, and there was no avoiding it. I didn't know if I was ready for what I was about to discover, but I knew I had no choice. The weight of responsibility on my shoulders, the weight of having entered this mystery without fully understanding the consequences, made me realize that the only way forward was to face head-on what was being hidden. It was as if I were being challenged, as if, by opening the door to room 5, I was opening a door to a truth that could change my life forever. The fear I felt wasn't just about the motel or the room next door. The fear lay in discovering who was behind it all, who was manipulating me, who was luring me into this plot, and what I meant within this dark game. Each discovery made me realize that the story I was trying to unravel wasn't just about murder or political conspiracies. It was about control, about power, about the fact that I was a pawn in a game much larger, more complex, more dangerous than I could ever imagine. Because the truth was within my reach, but still shrouded in shadow. What I was about to discover wasn't simple. It wasn't a mere coincidence or a power play between influential people. It was something that had much deeper roots, and I knew that the answer to this mystery could change the course of my life and everything I knew. The motel wasn't just a roadside retreat, and room 5 wasn't just a place to rest. They were the center of something much larger, something about to be revealed, and I had somehow been chosen to uncover this secret. The situation I found myself in grew even more tense as the hours passed. I knew I was in something bigger than I'd imagined, but what consumed me most was the feeling that fate had placed me precisely there to play a role in a story that had been unfolding long before I set foot in that motel. Fear, anxiety, and even physical exhaustion began to blend together, making it difficult to think clearly. But at the same time, something inside me told me the answer was right in front of me, hidden beneath the layers of mystery that accumulated with each step I took toward the truth. I was completely immersed in this enigma, no longer able to distinguish what was reality and what was merely a figment of my paranoid mind. The motel, the receptionist, room 5, and even the victims of the political assassinations were somehow connected, and I was now part of this web. But why me? Why had I been chosen to be a part of this? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew that finding out would be the only way out of this spiral of mystery and danger. And now I face a choice: continue searching for answers, even knowing the price to pay may be high, or simply leave and forget everything that happened. But honestly, I can't imagine a life where I can simply close my eyes to what I saw and felt that night. The truth is at my doorstep, and I can no longer ignore it. And you, what would you do in my shoes? How would you react if you were at the center of such a profound and, at the same time, so dangerous mystery? Leave your opinion in the comments below. I really want to know what you think about all this, and if you've been through something like this, be sure to share your experience. Every comment, every opinion helps me understand more about what I'm facing, and perhaps it will help us unravel this mystery even further. If you found this story intriguing, like the video to show your support, and if you want to follow more mysterious stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to be notified whenever a new mystery arises. And if you're curious to know what will happen in the next mystery, don't miss our next video. Until next time, and remember, not everything is as it seems. Comment: "This makes sense to me," if you also feel that something bigger is happening, something that goes far beyond what we can see at first glance, and that there is still more behind this story.